To outline today's event, the webinar in its entirety will run approximately 3.5 hours, which includes a Q&A panel session. And if you have questions now or during the webinar, please enter those questions into the Q&A chat pod and remember to indicate the speaker to whom the question is being addressed, for example, at Lei. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Lei Zhang to introduce GDUFA III meetings. Dr. Zhang is the Director, Office of Research and Standards in the Office of Generic Drugs. Next, we'll welcome Karen Bengtson to present on GDUFA III Redesigned Pre-Submission Meetings. Karen Bengtson is a Supervisory Regulatory Health Project Manager in the Office of Research and Standards in OGD. And finally, before our break, Dr. Tao Bai will present on GDUFA III Post-Complete Response Letter Scientific Meetings. Dr. Bai is a Senior Advisor, Office of Bioequivalence in OGD. Please join me to welcome Dr. Zhang.
Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon. My name is Lei Zhang. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Research and Standards, ORS, in the Office of Generic Drugs, OGD, at the FDA. Thank you for your interest and welcome to the SBIA webinar on a deep dive GDUFA III scientific meetings. In today's webinar, we will provide an in-depth look into the enhancements and new features of the following GDUFA III teleconference and meetings: pre-submission meetings, post-complete response letter CRL scientific meetings, product-specific guidance PSG teleconference, and PSG meetings, both pre-submission and post-submission PSG meetings. For each meeting, we will describe how and when to utilize those meetings to support generic drug development, and also provide clarification and best practices in meeting request and conduct. These meetings are highlighted in this webinar because they are either redesigned with changes as compared to GDUFA II or newly offered under GDUFA III. Here is the layout of today's agenda. Following this introduction, we will have 4 presentations to cover each meeting types in details. The redesigned pre-submission meetings by Karen Bengtson from ORS, new post-CRL scientific meetings by Dr. Tao Bai from Office of Bioequivalence, new PSG teleconferences by Calliope Sarago from ORS, and new PSG meetings by Dr. Hee-Sung Chang from Office of Bioequivalence. Following all these presentations, towards the last hour of this webinar, you will have a chance to ask questions. We will have additional panelists from the Office of Generic Drugs and the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality to join the speakers to address your questions. You may start to send questions through the Q&A box during the presentations. We look forward to your active participation. We will conclude the webinar with the closing remarks by ORS Director, Dr. Rob Limburger. There are multiple ways that industry can seek guidance from the FDA and for FDA to communicate with the applicants to facilitate generic drug development, including guidances, general or product-specific guidances. Written communication includes control correspondences or general correspondences, and industry meetings. In GDUFA II, a series of new meetings, namely product development meetings, pre-submission meetings, and mid-review cycle meetings, were started as part of the pre-ANDA program to assist prospective ANDA applicants of complex products before the submission of an ANDA to FDA. Complex products are in general harder to develop generics. These meetings are aiming to help improve ANDA submission, improve review efficiency, reduce review cycles, and accelerate access to complex generics. In GDUFA II, the product development meetings and pre-submission meetings have improved scientific advice during development and have facilitated pre-submission communication with the FDA. For ANDAs having pre-ANDA meetings, they were also entitled to the mid-review cycle meetings for update on the potential review issues and next steps. Post-CRL teleconferences have provided clarification to help resolve deficiencies. The success of the pre-ANDA meeting program has led to additional scientific meetings under GDUFA III. On September 30, 2022, the generic drug user fee amendments were reauthorized with provisions that are in effect from October 1, 2022 through September 30, 2027, also known as GDUFA III. In GDUFA III, a number of enhancements and changes are made to the existing generic drug program's pre-ANDA and ANDA process as it relates to scientific meetings that help provide clarity to the ANDA applicants. In this diagram, meetings continued from GDUFA II are in white color, and new meetings in GDUFA III are in orange color. Overall, there are more scientific engagements throughout the ANDA cycle. New meetings are added under GDUFA III with both pre- and post-submission enhancements to help move complex products and products that need FDA help in general towards approval. At pre-ANDA submission phase, product development meetings continue with no change. Pre-submission meetings are redesigned to focus on key issues for review and assure assessment team participation. During post-submission ANDA review phase, a new option of a more enhanced scientific mid-cycle review meeting called Enhanced MCRM is added, with a goal of resolving more substantive issues with a single review cycle with a goal date extension. During post-action phase, a new post-CRL scientific meeting is established to engage scientific discussion and facilitate subsequent cycle approval. In addition, under GDUFA III, PSG teleconferences and PSG meetings are introduced that can provide help and advice to applicants throughout the ANDA cycle to discuss the potential impact of PSG publication, either new or revision, on their development program if applicants have already commenced an in vivo B study. PSG teleconferences are used to triage the request and determine whether PSG meetings are warranted. Pre-submission meetings, post-CRL scientific meetings, PSG teleconferences, pre-submission PSG meetings, and post-submission PSG meetings will be discussed in more details at today's webinar. GDUFA III scientific meetings throughout the ANDA cycle help clarify regulatory expectations for prospective applicants early in product development, assist applicants in developing more complete quality submissions, also promote a more efficient and effective ANDA assessment process. Enhanced communications through those meetings also provide targeted and robust advice aiming for meeting the standards for ANDA approval, thus reduce the number of assessment cycles required to obtain ANDA approval. Under GDUFA III, teleconference and meetings are two broad meeting types. As a meeting type, teleconference is not a meeting. To differentiate from the teleconference, under GDUFA III, meetings are narrowly defined as a face-to-face interactions that can be held either as a video conference or in person. Teleconference, on the other hand, is defined by the commitment letter as a verbal communication by telephone. All industry pre-ANDA or ANDA meetings are either teleconferences or meetings as shown in the next slide. As of a note, teleconference is one of the meeting types as well as one of the meeting formats that will be discussed later. This diagram shows GDUFA III teleconferences on the left side and meetings on the right side. Mid-cycle review meeting, post-CRL clarification teleconference, and a PSG teleconference are teleconferences under GDUFA III. Product development meeting, pre-submission meeting, enhanced mid-cycle review meeting, post-CRL scientific meeting, pre-submission PSG meeting, and post-submission PSG meetings are meetings under GDUFA III. Teleconferences are clarification in nature, and meetings engage more scientific discussion. In today's webinar, we will cover 1 teleconference and 4 scientific meetings in details. In terms of meeting format, there are 4 meeting formats for scientific meetings as defined in the formal meeting guidance. They are in-person face-to-face meetings, video conferences, teleconferences, and written response only. In-person face-to-face meetings are held in a hybrid format in which core staff participate in person at the FDA with additional attendees participate virtually via a video connection. Video conferences are fully remote in which all attendees participate from various remote locations via video connection. Teleconference are verbal communication by voice, and written response only is for FDA providing responses in writing. Meetings are typically held as in-person face-to-face or as video conferences. FDA may provide a teleconference or written response only for meetings if requested by the applicant or if the meeting is granted at FDA's discretion. For teleconferences, there are only 2 meeting formats, teleconference or written response only, when requested or agreed to by the applicant. We noticed that some applicants may take video conference and teleconference as the same. However, we would like to clarify that under GDUFA III, video conference and teleconference are 2 different meeting formats. They are not the same or interchangeable, although FDA may use the same platform, for example Zoom, to conduct teleconference and video conference. Video conferences allow for both audio and visual communication. For scientific meetings, like pre-ENDA meetings, video conferences are typically more effective than teleconferences, considering the complexity of the scientific nature of the discussion. Video conference will not only facilitate discussion, but also can serve as an alternate to in-person face-to-face meetings. Teleconferences, on the other hand, are voice-only with no projection of presentation materials or use of video camera. Teleconferences are more appropriate for discussing clarification questions. There are also specific meeting types that are strictly teleconference, for example, PSG teleconferences. Applicants should request the desired meeting format in the meeting request, considering the different meeting format options available for the type of the meetings they are requesting, and ask for the format that suits their needs. Do not request a teleconference if you want a video conference. FDA will confirm the meeting format at the time of granting the meeting. If a meeting is granted as a teleconference, it will be voice only with no projection of the presentations or use of the camera, and will not be converted to a video conference on the meeting date. Occasionally, a scientific meeting granted as video conference may be conducted as a teleconference if the applicant specifically requests a teleconference due to technical logistical difficulties, or if upon reviewing FDA's preliminary responses, the applicant deems the questions remained are clarification in nature. During the COVID-19 pandemic, in-person face-to-face meetings have been conducted in virtual with video conferences. Now, COVID-19 public health emergency ended on May 11th last week. Since March 27, 2023, FDA has resumed in-person face-to-face meetings for ANDA applicants with an phased-in approach, starting with 2 pre-ANDA meetings, that is, product development meetings and pre-submission meetings. Applicants can request in-person face-to-face meetings for these 2 meeting types. For these 2 meeting types, FDA may grant in-person face-to-face meeting if applicant requests and if the meeting request meets the criteria for granting. As of today, all other scientific meetings under GDUFA III will be default to video conference if in-person face-to-face meeting is requested. When FDA will resume in-person face-to-face meetings for these other scientific meetings under GDUFA III will be determined and announced in the future. In-person face-to-face meeting requests may be limited by facility capacity and logistical considerations. In these situations, video conference will be the default option. Requests for an in-person face-to-face meeting must be part of the initial meeting request package received. As I mentioned earlier, as of today, in-person face-to-face meeting requests for other scientific meeting types under GDUFA III, if granted, will be held fully virtually. Existing meetings received or scheduled before March 27, 2023 will not be converted to the in-person format. All in-person face-to-face meetings will be an in-person and video conference hybrid. In-person face-to-face meetings will be held with just the core participants from FDA with industry participants. From FDA, it is likely to be project managers, meeting chair, subject matter experts with an anticipated primary speaking role. All other participants will be remote via video and audio connection. Here is the challenge question. Starting March 27, 2023, what kind of meetings can an ANDA applicant request as an in-person meeting? A. Product development meetings. B. Pre-submission meetings. C. Post-CRL scientific meetings. D. A and B and E, all of the above. The correct answer is D, A and B. At this time, only product development meetings and pre-submission meetings may be granted as an in-person meeting if it is requested by the applicant and if the meeting request meeting the granting criteria. In summary, multiple enhancements are added to the industry meetings under GDUFA III to provide input throughout the product life cycle, with more meetings in different situations, more transparency, and more efficient development and decision about complex generics. FDA developed this GDUFA III teleconference and meeting infographic to help navigate through various TCONs and meetings based on ANDA stages and product complexity. Here are some resources for additional information. 2 guidances that are most relevant to the GDUFA III meetings covered today are highlighted in yellow. Although mid-cycle review meetings and enhanced middle-cycle review meetings are not covered in today's webinar, you may find a YouTube video presentation from the FDA that provides additional details on these 2 meetings. Thank you for your attention. You may start to send questions through the Q&A box during the presentations. We look forward to your active participation. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and hello to all those joining us today. Again, I'm Karen Bengtson, and I'll be presenting an overview of the pre-submission meeting. Pre-submission meetings, although not a new meeting type, were redesigned under GDUFA III. During the presentation, I will cover the purpose and scope of the redesigned pre-submission meeting, new timeline and changes to the overall meeting process, and information on what should be included in your meeting package, and when, where, and how to submit your request for a pre-submission meeting. The Pre-ANDA program was first introduced in GDUFA II and is designed to facilitate the approval of complex generic products by clarifying regulatory expectations for prospective applicants early in product development, assisting applicants in developing more complete submissions, promoting a more efficient and effective ANDA assessment process, and ultimately reducing the number of assessment cycles needed to obtain ANDA approval. The definition of a complex product did not change from GDUFA II to GDUFA III. According to the definition in the commitment letter, a complex product generally includes one or more of the following features: complex active ingredients, formulations, dosage forms, routes of administration, or a complex drug-device combination product. Other products can be considered complex when there's complexity or uncertainty concerning the approval pathway, or a possible alternative approach would benefit from early scientific engagement. Pre-ANDA meetings are only one part of the pre-ANDA program, along with control correspondence, product-specific guidance, and GDUFA research. Pre-ANDA meetings, which include product development and pre-submission meetings, were introduced to facilitate pre-submission communications between FDA and prospective applicants related to complex products and/or complicated drug development questions. Although there were no changes to the product development meeting in GDUFA III, the pre-submission meeting was redesigned with a new purpose, scope, and shorter overall timeline. In the subsequent slides, I'll go through these changes in more detail. In GDUFA II, pre-submission meetings provided an opportunity for prospective applicants to discuss or explain the content and format of an upcoming ANDA submission. Now, in GDUFA III, it provides applicants the opportunity to present to the agency the unique or novel data or information that will be included in an upcoming ANDA submission, such as formulation, key studies, justifications, methods used in product development, and interrelationship of data and information in the ANDA. It's important to note that this meeting does not include a substantive assessment of summary data or full study reports by FDA and is not an opportunity to determine whether the ANDA is acceptable for receipt. For example, the prospective ANDA applicant should not request or expect guidance on whether certain components needed for receipt consideration may be omitted from the ANDA. In the GDUFA III commitment letter, FDA agreed to grant a pre-submission meeting if a prospective applicant was granted a prior product development meeting for the same complex product. A prior product development meeting granted for the same complex product in any meeting format, meaning whether it's granted as in-person face-to-face, video conference, teleconference, or as a written response only, would meet the criteria for when FDA will grant a pre-submission meeting, assuming that the meeting request and package are complete. In addition, if a prospective applicant cancels a meeting because they have received and are satisfied with the FDA's preliminary response, it would also meet the eligibility criteria. FDA also agreed to grant a pre-submission meeting when FDA believes in its sole discretion that a pre-submission meeting would improve the ANDA assessment efficiency. Prospective ANDA applicants do not need to have a prior product development meeting to request a pre-submission meeting. However, the FDA recommends that prospective applicants of complex products seek FDA's input via a product development meeting prior to submitting a request for a pre-submission meeting so that FDA has the knowledge of the prospective applicant's development program at the time of the pre-submission meeting. In general, pre-submission meeting requests for non-complex products will be denied. However, FDA may grant a meeting for a non-complex product if FDA decides that the pre-submission meeting would improve the ANDA assessment efficiency and also dependent on available resources. In this image, I want to highlight the changes to the pre-submission meeting timeline under GDUFA III and also note some of the items that did not change. During GDUFA II, FDA agreed to grant or deny a meeting request within 14 days of FDA receipt and to hold the meeting within 120 days of granting the meeting. For GDUFA III, FDA agreed to grant or deny a meeting within 30 days of FDA receipt and hold the meeting within 60 days of FDA receipt, resulting in an overall shorter meeting timeline. There was no change to the timeline for preliminary comments, which are issued at least 5 days prior to the meeting scheduled date, or for the meeting minutes, which will be issued within 30 days of the meeting date. It's recommended that a pre-submission meeting be requested about 6 to 8 months prior to the anticipated ANDA submission. It's recommended that you thoroughly review the revised guidance for industry on formal meetings between FDA and ANDA applicants of complex products under GDUFA for the most complete information on suggested content and format of your meeting package. You will find the link to the guidance in this slide as well as in the resources slide at the end of the presentation. Your package should be submitted at the same time as your meeting request. And in general, high-level information is sufficient. Your meeting package should not in general include any questions to the agency. If you have questions related to your product development program, those questions should be submitted in either a product development meeting request or as a controlled correspondence as appropriate. In your pre-submission meeting package, you should indicate whether you've had a prior product development meeting for the same complex product and provide the corresponding event ID or IDs if you've had multiple pre-ANDA product development meetings and a summary of the advice provided. If you've not had a prior product development meeting with the agency, provide an explanation for why a pre-submission meeting should be granted. Also in your package, you should include the estimated timeline for submission of your ANDA and the unique or novel data or information that will be included in your ANDA submission. You also have the option to submit your meeting package in the format of a draft meeting presentation. Appendix B of the formal meeting guidance includes a suggested presentation outline template listing items that prospective applicants should consider, including or addressing in their presentation. This is not an exhaustive list, so there may be additional items that you should consider including. Some examples of the type of information that you should include in your meeting package and presentation when applicable include alternative bioequivalent study design to the PSG recommendation, novel in vitro drug release testing methods, new statistical method used for supporting bioequivalence, novel or unique approaches to development, manufacture, or control strategy of the drug product, novel bioanalytical methods used in the in vivo bioequivalence study, or a novel analytical method used in the in vitro bioequivalence study, if there are design differences identified in the user interface of the proposed product when compared to the reference listed drug. If you did not previously have a product development meeting or do not have a pre-assigned ANDA number, you should obtain one prior to submitting your request for a pre-submission meeting. Information on how to request a pre-assigned application number can be found using the link included here. Pre-submission meeting requests should be submitted using the CDER Direct Next-Gen portal, also known as the portal. When you're in the portal, you will need to select the type of meeting that you're requesting, which will be shown as an ANDA pre-submission meeting. You will then be asked to indicate if you've had a prior product development meeting with the FDA for the same product. If you indicate yes, you will be prompted to enter the associated event ID of the product development meeting that was held. Within the first 30 days of receipt of your meeting request, parallel grant deny assessments are performed by both the Office of Generic Drugs and the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. However, note that FDA will make one unified grant deny decision. If granting, FDA will identify ANDA assessment team members who will attend the pre-submission meeting. In addition, in the grant letter, FDA will identify additional topics that the prospective applicant should address during the meeting when applicable. If denying, FDA will provide the reason for denial in the letter. Grant deny letters will be issued by day 30 of receipt of your meeting request. Pre-submission meetings are offered as in-person face-to-face or video conference meetings. Due to the nature of the meeting, teleconference and written response only formats are not offered. As of March 27, 2023, prospective applicants can now request in-person face-to-face meetings for either product development or pre-submission meetings. If a request meets the criteria in the GDUFA III commitment letter, FDA will generally grant the requested meeting format. However, if FDA grants above and beyond the criteria in the GDUFA III commitment letter, FDA will determine the appropriate meeting format. The meeting format and the scheduling information will be included in your meeting request granted letter, and the project manager from the Office of Research and Standards will be assigned as your primary point of contact through the pre-submission meeting process. FDA will generally not issue information requests for pre-submission meetings. Draft presentations may be updated up to 21 days prior to the meeting so that FDA may provide the preliminary comments at least 5 days before the meeting date. Final presentations should be submitted at least 48 hours prior to the scheduled meeting. FDA will issue the preliminary written comments no later than day 5 prior to the meeting, but FDA may indicate that there are no comments to provide at that time. Preliminary comments should not result in the cancellation of a pre-submission meeting. Pre-submission meetings will be scheduled to be held within 60 days of the FDA receipt date of your meeting request. As we return to in-person, face-to-face meetings for both product development and pre-submission meetings, we want to remind everybody that at least 2 weeks prior to the scheduled meeting date, you'll be asked to provide to the assigned meeting project manager the following information: the updated list of all your meeting participants, including the name, title, and company affiliation. In addition, you'll be asked for relevant information for any foreign national visitors participating in the meeting in person. A foreign visitor data request form will be included in your meeting request granted letter for the pre-submission meeting, and you will be required to complete one form for each foreign visitor. All visitors must present a valid government-issued photo identification on the day of the meeting. Foreign national visitors must present the passport that matches the information provided to the project manager, or their entry will be denied on the meeting date. Lawful permanent residents of the United States must present a valid LPR card. Other forms of identification will not be accepted. Pre-submission meetings are typically granted as 60-minute meetings, and prospective applicants' presentations will help orient the discussion during the meeting. FDA attendees will include members of the ANDA assessment team and participants in any prior product development meeting as applicable. At the meeting, FDA staff will identify items or information that should be clarified before submission of your ANDA. If the prospective applicant would like FDA to consider their meeting summary, they should submit their meeting summary within 7 calendar days of the meeting date via the portal. FDA will issue meeting minutes within 30 calendar days of the meeting date, and the FDA-issued meeting minutes are considered the official and final record of the meeting. A prospective applicant requesting additional clarification of the meeting minutes issued by FDA should contact the assigned FDA point of contact. Notify the agency in writing of any significant differences in understanding regarding the meeting outcome within 10 days of receipt of the official meeting minutes. If the minutes are determined to accurately and sufficiently reflect the meeting discussion, the point of contact will convey this decision to the prospective applicant, and the minutes will stand as the official documentation of the meeting. If FDA deems it necessary to change the official minutes, the changes will be documented in an addendum to the official minutes, and the addendum will also document any continued objections. Challenge question number 1. FDA recommends that a pre-submission meeting request be submitted how far in advance of the ANDA submission? A, 12 months, B, 6 to 8 months, C, 10 to 12 months, or D, 2 to 3 months? The answer is B, 6 to 8 months prior to the ANDA submission. Challenge question number 2. Which of the following statements is not true? A. In GDUFA III, pre-submission meetings provide prospective applicants the opportunity to present unique or novel data or information that will be included in the ANDA submission. B. For a pre-submission meeting, FDA will not provide a substantive assessment of summary data or full study reports. C. A pre-submission meeting will be granted as a teleconference or written response only if requested by the prospective applicant. D. The meeting package for a pre-submission meeting can be submitted in the format of a draft presentation. The correct answer is C. Due to the nature of a pre-submission meeting, meeting formats are only offered as either in-person face-to-face or as a video conference. In summary, pre-submission meetings have been redesigned for GDUFA III with a new scope and timeline. This meeting provides prospective applicants of complex products the opportunity to present to the agency the unique or novel data or information that will be included in their upcoming ANDA submission. FDA will identify members of the ANDA assessment team to attend the pre-submission meeting and anticipates FDA staff that participated in a prior product development meeting will also be in attendance when applicable. At the meeting, FDA will identify items or information that should be clarified before submission of the ANDA. FDA will grant or deny a pre-submission meeting request within 30 calendar days of the FDA receive date, and if granted, hold the meeting within 60 calendar days of receipt. A request for a pre-submission meeting should be approximately 6 to 8 months before the anticipated ANDA submission date, and it's recommended that prospective applicants of complex products seek FDA's input via a product development meeting prior to requesting a pre-submission meeting so that FDA has knowledge of your development program at the time of the pre-submission meeting. Included is a slide of references that may be helpful to you if you're considering to submit a pre-submission meeting. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll be part of the Q&A panel later to answer any questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the GDUFA III meeting webinar. Next, I'll give you an overview of a new GDUFA III meeting, a post-complete response letter CRL scientific meeting. Since October 1st, 2022, ANDA applicants can request a post-CRL scientific meeting for FDA to provide scientific advice on possible approaches to address deficiencies identified in the CRL related to establishing equivalence. In today's presentation, I'll walk you through several key aspects related to this meeting and share with you some advice based on the submissions so far. I'll start my presentation with an introduction of GDUFA III meetings, particularly this new Post-CRL scientific meeting. Then clarify the purpose of this meeting, followed by discussing its grant-denied decision criteria, as well as its meeting process and key timelines. In the end, I'll give you some ideas of the current state of this meeting request submission and share with you some advice based on what the agency has seen so far. Then I'll end my presentation with 2 challenge questions for CE purposes. This is an overview diagram for all GDUFA III meetings. These meetings are grouped in 3 areas. First, pre-end submission. Second, post-end submission but before any actions. Last, post-actions. Post-CRL scientific meeting occurs in the post-action stage, and any ANDA that's in complete response status after October 1st, 2022 and meets the eligibility requirements is eligible to submit a meeting request. The purpose of GDUFA ANDA Assessment Meeting Program is to provide targeted, robust advice to ANDA applicants as they work to meet the standards for ANDA approval. In GDUFA III, this new meeting, Post-CRL Scientific Meeting, has been added to the GDUFA program. The purpose of this meeting is to provide an applicant scientific advice on possible approaches to address scientific deficiencies identified in the CRL related to establishing equivalence. The Post-CRL scientific meeting is intended to discuss one or more of the topics listed in this blue box as it relates to establishing equivalence. First, a new equivalence study is needed to address the deficiencies in the study design identified in the CRL. Second, using an approach that's different from the what's submitted in the ANDA, for example, a change in the study type from in vivo study to an in vitro study. Third, a new comparative use human factor study, or number 4, using a new approach to demonstrating sameness of a complex active ingredient. So if the questions are related to one or more of these topics, and if it is for a complex generic product, FDA will grant the meeting. FDA will also grant the meeting if in FDA's judgment the request raises issues that are best addressed via the meeting and cannot be adequately addressed through controlled correspondence. FDA will communicate the grant denied decision to the applicant within 14 days after the receipt of the request, and FDA will hold the post-CRL scientific meeting within 90 days after the meeting is granted. Please note that an ANDA applicant may have a post-CRL teleconference to seek clarification concerning deficiencies identified in the CRL prior to requesting this meeting. However, the ANDA applicant does not have to have had a post-CRL teleconference prior to requesting a post-CRL scientific meeting. Also, ANDA applicants can request a post-CRL scientific meeting even if they have not had a product development meeting with the agency. In the next 3 slides, I'll discuss in details about the 3 scenarios about this meeting, including will grant situation, may grant situation, and maybe denial situation. For the will grant scenario, as discussed on the previous slide, FDA will grant the post-CRL scientific meeting request if the meeting request is for a complex generic product and the questions raised in the meeting request is related to one or more of the 4 topics presented here, which is also shared on the previous GDUFA III commitment letter slide. FDA may grant the post-CRL scientific meeting request if in FDA's judgment, the questions or issues raised in the meeting request package are best addressed via the meeting process and cannot be adequately addressed through controlled correspondence. Again, here, we would like to emphasize that this meeting is intended to discuss any of these 4 main topics: a new equivalence study to address the deficiencies, a new proposed approach, a new comparative use human factor study, or a new approach to demonstrating complex API sameness. On the other hand, together, let's take a look at the scenarios that FDA may deny a post-CRL scientific meeting request. FDA may deny a post-CRL scientific meeting request because the product does not meet the criteria for a complex product. For example, complex API or complex formulation, drug-device combination product, etc. Or in FDA's judgment, the questions submitted in the meeting request can be actively addressed through controlled correspondence. Or the meeting request does not discuss one of the 4 topics discussing the GDUFA III commitment letter as it relates to establishing equivalence. Okay, now let's together review some important timelines for this new GDUFA III meeting, post-CRL scientific meeting. They're listed on this slide and colored in red. First, FDA will make grant or deny decision within 14 days after receipt of this post-CRL scientific meeting request. Second, if granted, FDA will hold the meeting either in person or video conference or have a teleconference within 90 days after the meeting is granted. If you request a written response instead, the written response will be issued within 90 days after it is granted as well. Here, please note that it is 90 days after the meeting is granted, not 90 days from the meeting request is submitted. So number 3, if granted 5 days prior to the meeting with the applicant, FDA will also issue a preliminary response to applicant's questions. And lastly, the final meeting minutes will be issued within 30 days of the meeting or teleconference. Please note that if a due date falls on a weekend or federal holiday, it will be moved to the preceding business day. Once a grant-denied decision has been made by FDA, the applicant will either receive a denial letter if the post-CRL scientific meeting request has been denied. On the denial letter, reasons for denying the meeting request will be stated. If the meeting request has been granted, the applicant will receive a grant letter from FDA on which FDA will state the meeting date, meeting time, or a go date for providing a written response, if a written response is to be provided, as well as preliminary list of FDA attendees for the meeting and the decided format of the meeting, which include in-person, face-to-face, when this option becomes available in the future, or video conference, or teleconference, or written response only. Here, I'd like to draw your attention to the differences between a video conference and a teleconference. Please be aware that a video conference includes both audio and visual communication between FDA and applicants. At a video conference, at a minimum, core members who have the speaking roles are expected to turn on their cameras while speaking. If it is really needed, and the applicants may request to use presentation to support the discussion at the video conference. But in those cases, the decision should be discussed ahead of time with FDA point of contact, and the presentation materials should be shared with FDA ahead of the meeting. We're going to discuss this aspect a little bit more in details in next few slides. Well, for teleconference, it means video only. Neither FDA or any applicant representatives need to open their cameras while speaking. No presentation will be used as a supporting tool during the teleconference. So with that, FDA advises an applicant to properly select the format of the meeting and indicate clearly in the meeting package that which meeting format is preferred. This is to ensure a productive meeting with FDA. Now let's talk about what are expected to be included in the meeting package. In addition to the general information related to the ANDA, for example, ANDA number, drug product name, RLD information, purpose and objective of this meeting, etc., a post-CRL scientific meeting package should clearly indicate that this is a post-CRL scientific meeting request and include a brief statement indicating how the product meets the criteria for a complex product if applicable. In addition, the meeting package should clearly state which of the 4 criteria previously discussed on my slide that are related to establishing equivalence will be focused on in the meeting, and provide sufficient data to support the discussion. Also, the applicant should clearly state that the requested format, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Just like any other GDUFA meetings, a post-CRL scientific meeting can be canceled as well. For example, the applicant may withdraw their meeting request at any time based on their business or other reasons. Or once received the preliminary written response comments and the applicant informs the FDA that its questions have been adequately addressed by the preliminary written response comments, or based on FDA newly issued product-specific guidance, and the applicant feels that meeting is no longer necessary because the newly published PSG may help address the questions in the meeting package, so they do not think there is a need to meeting with FDA for these questions anymore. For post-CRL scientific meetings, FDA intends to provide preliminary written comments to the end applicants no later than 5 calendar days before the meeting. This communication before the meeting can serve as a foundation for discussion or as the final meeting responses. However, preliminary written comments should not be considered as final unless there is agreement between the applicant and FDA that additional discussion is not necessary for any questions. If both agree that based on the preliminary written response comments, any particular questions are considered resolved, we may dedicate the meeting discussion to the rest of the unresolved questions. Or, as discussed in an earlier slide, the meeting may be canceled because the applicant finds the preliminary written response comments are adequate to address all their questions. Here, please notify that after receiving the preliminary written response comments, the applicant should provide an updated agenda with its list of questions for discussion in order of priority, no later than 48 hours before the scheduled meeting. In general, presentations by applicants are not needed for this meeting because the information necessary for review and discussion should already be part of the meeting package. However, if you still plan to make a presentation during the meeting, the decision should be discussed ahead of time with the FDA point of contact. Please keep the presentations brief in order to maximize the time available for discussion. Any presentation material should be shared with FDA point of contact at least 48 hours prior to the meeting. Here, I'd like to emphasize that the preliminary written response comments communicated by FDA should not generate the submission of any new questions. And new questions will not be entertained at the meeting in general. In order to have a meaningful and productive discussion at the meeting, the discussion should focus on any remaining questions that have not been adequately addressed by the preliminary written response comments, or any clarification questions you may have based on the preliminary written response comments that FDA has shared. After the meeting is held, FDA will issue an official finalized minutes to the applicant within 30 days. FDA's minutes are considered the official record of this meeting. If the applicant believes there is a discrepancy in the minutes, they may submit their concerns in writing within 10 calendar days of the receipt of the official meeting minutes. As of April 28, 2023, FDA has received 11 post-CRL scientific meeting requests. 7 meeting requests met the acceptance criteria and have been granted by FDA. Based on the submission of this new GDUFA III post-CRL scientific meeting, I'd like to share some advice with you. First, please note that FDA will not pre-review any specific scientific data submitted in the meeting package. So questions related to whether any submitted data is considered acceptable is outside of the scope of this meeting. Second, if any new study or new approach has been discussed in the meeting request, FDA may comment on the general acceptability of this new study or new approach, but the ultimate acceptability of the proposed new study or new approach will be further assessed with additional relevant information upon the submission and amendment. With that, I'd like to end my presentation with 2 pieces of important references. One is the guidance for formal meetings between FDA and applicants of complex products on the GDUFA. In October 2022, FDA published a revised version of this guidance by incorporating any GDUFA III related changes to the formal meetings. You may use this link here to access this guidance. The other reference is FDA GDUFA III reauthorization page. Here you'll be able to find all GDUFA III related resources, including negotiation, public meetings, commitment letter, and related guidances and maps, etc. You may use this link on the bottom to access this page. Here comes the challenge questions. Challenge question number 1. Is following statement true or false? A post-CRL scientific meeting request can only be submitted after first submitting a post-CRL teleconference to the agency. The correct answer is false. You may submit a post-CRL teleconference to clarify any deficiencies in the CRL, but you don't have to submit a post-CRL teleconference before submitting a post-CRL scientific meeting request to the agency. Challenge question number 2. My application was submitted prior to October 1st, 2022, but now it is in CR status. Is my application still eligible to request post-CRL scientific meeting? The answer is yes. Any ANDA application, regardless its submission date, as long as it is in complete response status after October 1st, 2022, is eligible to submit a post-CRL scientific meeting if it meets the eligibility requirements for this meeting. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. I'll come back during the Q&A session to answer any questions you may have for this new GDUFA III meeting, post-CRL scientific meeting. Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentations. We'll now enter into our break until 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Enjoy your break. Together with the survey link. Moving into our next presentation, Calliope Sarago will present on GDUFA III Product-Specific Guidance Teleconferences. Calliope Sarago is a Senior Regulatory Health Project Manager in the Office of Research and Standards in OGD. And finally, our final presentation will be on the GDUFA III Product-Specific Guidance meetings by Dr. Hee-San Chung. Dr. Chung is a lead pharmacologist in the Division of Bioequivalence 1, Office of Bioequivalence, and OGD. Please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Calliope Sargo.
Good afternoon. Today I will cover GDUFA III Product-Specific Guidance Teleconferences, a new format of communication with the FDA for GDUFA III. Our learning objectives for today are: describe the PSG teleconference process, flow, and timeline, break down the elements of pre-submission and post-submission PSG teleconferences, explain when, what, and how to submit your PSG teleconference request, identify reasons for granting and denying your PSG teleconference, describe how FDA will schedule and hold the PSG teleconference, and finally, explain canceling, rescheduling the teleconference, issuing FDA minutes, and dispute of minutes process. This diagram is an overview of the PSG teleconference process. Upon receipt of your PSG teleconference request, FDA will conduct an assessment of the acceptability of your teleconference package. FDA will issue a grant or denial letter within 14 calendar days of receipt of your request. If a PSG teleconference request is denied, written notification will include an explanation of the reasons for your denial. If granted, an assessment team will meet to assess your teleconference request. FDA will hold your PSG teleconference within 30 calendar days of receipt of your request or issue a written response-only letter if it's granted in that format. PSG teleconference minutes are issued within 30 calendar days of holding your teleconference. To note, FDA will not issue an information request or preliminary written comments for a PSG teleconference. PSG teleconferences. A PSG teleconference provides a format for applicants to obtain FDA's feedback on the potential impact of a new or revised PSG on an applicant's development program. Criteria for submission are when a new or revised PSG is published on or after October 1st, 2022, and an applicant or prospective applicant has commenced or completed an in vivo bioequivalence study. Commenced means the study protocol has been signed by the study sponsor and/or contract research organization. A PSG teleconference is not intended for in-depth scientific discussion. This type of PSG meeting will be discussed in the next presentation. A PSG teleconference can be requested in the pre-ANDA phase and after ANDA submission. A PSG teleconference can be requested for a complex or non-complex drug product. This slide provides a summary of the PSG teleconference timeframe and process. 14 calendar days to grant or deny your request from receipt. Keep in mind the commitment letter does not define a timeframe for the grant or deny decision. Your teleconference will be held within 30 calendar days of receipt. Keep in mind the 30-day teleconference hold date applies to requests and complete packages submitted within 60 days after publication of a new or revised PSG. Your request must meet criteria set forth in the draft guidance. Guidance meetings between FDA and ANDA applicants under GDUFA, which was published in February of 2023. There is a link to the guidance in the references at the end of the presentation. The duration of a teleconference is 60 minutes. The format is either teleconference or written response only. If a request meets criteria in the GDUFA III commitment letter for a PSG teleconference, FDA will generally grant the requested format. If the request does not meet criteria, it's FDA's discretion to grant written response only or direct the applicant to submit a controlled correspondence instead of holding a PSG teleconference. Keep in mind that during an ANDA assessment cycle, a controlled correspondence may only be submitted if an applicant seeks further feedback from FDA after a PSG teleconference has been held. PSG teleconference overview. An applicant can request only one PSG teleconference for each new or revised PSG posted. A teleconference means a verbal communication by telephone, which is audio only. FDA will not share documents or video. If a written response only format is granted, responses will issue in lieu of holding a teleconference. As previously stated, FDA will not provide preliminary written comments or information requests. When should I submit a PSG teleconference request? When FDA issues a notice in the Federal Register announcing the availability of new and revised PSGs posted on the PSG webpage. A link to the PSG webpage is provided for reference. Generally, FDA publishes PSGs in batches on a quarterly basis. FDA recommends an applicant submit a PSG teleconference request within 60 calendar days after publication, the date recommended, of the new or revised PSG. The publication date of a PSG is the day the PSG is posted on the PSG webpage. The date recommended will be listed on the PSG webpage and is highlighted here for reference. When to submit PSG teleconference request continued. The key takeaway we want to emphasize for submission is when FDA publishes a new or revised PSG that introduces or revises a recommendation related to an in vivo BE study, and the applicant has already commenced or completed an in vivo BE study. For post-submission PSG teleconferences, FDA also intends to offer opportunity for a PSG teleconference for the following. When FDA publishes a new PSG, which includes a recommendation to conduct an in vivo BE study, and the ANDA applicant did not conduct an in vivo BE study. FDA offers the ability to request a PSG teleconference for this scenario, even though such applicants may not meet all the criteria in the GDUFA commitment letter. Another criteria is when FDA publishes a revised PSG, which includes a recommendation to conduct an in vivo BE study. The previous PSG did not include a recommendation to conduct an in vivo BE study, and the ANDA applicant commenced or completed the in vitro BE study or studies that were either recommended by FDA in the previous PSG or that the ANDA applicant decided to pursue after a prior product development meeting. When not to submit a post-submission PSG teleconference. When a PSG is revised to include an in vivo BE study as an additional option to the in vitro BE study that was recommended in the previous PSG, and the applicant followed the recommendations in the previous PSG. What should be included in your teleconference request and package? I'm not going to go over a complete list of all information that is needed in your submission. I'm only going to highlight some key features. Please refer to the Guidance in GDUFA III commitment letter for additional details on what to provide in your submission. Please include in your submission a valid pre-assignment ANDA number or ANDA number. Include the type of meeting you are requesting, and in this case it would be a PSG teleconference. This information should be identified in your cover letter. The month and year the current PSG was published. A description of how your study differs from the recommendation in the PSG, and if applicable, a statement indicating that the in vivo study is impacted by the new or revised PSG. A signature page of the relevant in vivo BE study protocol that has been signed by the study sponsor and or contract research organization. In the background section, include a brief history of development program, the status of your product development, the purpose and objectives. Your meeting package should provide information for FDA to assess the utility of the package and identify appropriate staff. The requested format and proposed agenda outlining how the 60 minutes will be allocated for each agenda item. Keep in mind the meeting package should be received at the time of the meeting request. How should you submit a pre-submission PSG teleconference? Submit your pre-submission request and package for a pre-submission teleconference electronically through the CDER Direct Next Gen Collaboration Portal. Identify your submission as a PSG teleconference in your cover page. In this slide, I will highlight key features in the portal for your pre-submission teleconference submission. As highlighted in red, an applicant will need to provide an ANDA pre-assignment number. Keep in mind, this is only needed for pre-submission teleconferences. An applicant will also be required to select the type of request. And again, in this case, a pre-submission PSG teleconference would be selected. An applicant will also provide a brief description of the teleconference. For example, you may want to use the teleconference to obtain agency feedback on the potential impact of a new or revised PSG on your drug development program. Continuing with pre-submission teleconferences, the PSG teleconferences are only valid for PSG recommendation dates for PSGs posted on or after October 1st, 2022. An applicant will also need to add a protocol signature date. Keep in mind, the signature date must be before the PSG recommendation date. How to submit a post-submission PSG teleconference. A post-submission PSG teleconference should be submitted once an ANDA is in-house. The request is submitted electronically through the Enterprise Submission Gateway. The request should be submitted as a general information amendment, and the cover page should identify the submission as a post-PSG teleconference request. I have provided a reference link to the ECTD submission guidance. Your PSG teleconference request was granted. What happens next? FDA will provide written notification to the applicant of the decision and format, either teleconference or written response only. Scheduling information is provided in the grant letter or as soon as possible following the granting of your request. If FDA is providing written responses only, instead of holding a teleconference, FDA will notify the applicant of the written response only format. FDA schedules the teleconference by determining the date, time, length, format, and expected FDA participants. Teleconferences are scheduled within the GDUFA III performance goals if a teleconference request is received within 60 days of PSG publication. The teleconference is held within 30 calendar days of receipt of your request. What happens if your teleconference request is denied? If an applicant has not met criteria outlined in the guidance and commitment letter, the PSG teleconference request may be denied. Some examples would include if the applicant's in vivo BE study started after the PSG was published or the request is incomplete. An incomplete request, for example, would be if an applicant did not include the signature page signed by the study sponsor or contract research organization. When FDA publishes a new or revised PSG, which includes a recommendation to conduct an in vitro BE study, and the applicant has commenced or completed an in vivo BE study, submission of the in vivo BE study is generally an acceptable approach for demonstrating BE. FDA recommends an applicant include supporting information with its ANDA to justify the in vivo approach used that deviates from the in vitro approach recommended in the PSG to demonstrate BE. To note, if a teleconference request is denied, written notification to the applicant will include an explanation of the reason for the denial. A subsequent PSG teleconference request is considered a new request and assigned new timeframes. The day of your teleconference. Teleconferences are typically 1 hour. Discussion will focus on how the applicant's BE studies differ from the studies recommended in the PSG. FDA will not address or discuss any new data or questions outside of the scope of the PSG teleconference. FDA can provide general advice or recommendations. And generally, applicants will be asked to summarize important discussion points, agreements, and action items to ensure mutual understanding of meeting outcomes and action items. PSG teleconference outcomes. To obtain FDA's feedback on the applicant's development program. If additional clarification or discussion is needed after the teleconference, FDA will recommend an appropriate path for future communication. This may include controlled correspondences, pre- or post-submission PSG meetings, or other meeting types as appropriate. To note, applicants should not submit multiple meeting requests or controlled correspondence at or around the same time with the same or similar questions. The teleconference minutes. Teleconference minutes are issued within 30 calendar days after the teleconference. Applicants may submit their summary within 7 calendar days of the meeting's date. FDA-issued minutes are the official record of the teleconference. Dispute of teleconference minutes. This was discussed in a previous presentation by Karen Bengtson, so I will only highlight key issues as the process is the same for PSG teleconferences. An applicant requesting additional clarification of minutes should contact their assigned FDA point of contact. You should submit your concerns about the minutes in writing to FDA within 10 calendar days of receipt of the official minutes. Requests should only address issues that are regarding the minutes only. If an applicant needs to discuss additional issues that were not addressed in the teleconference, we recommend submitting a controlled correspondence or a new meeting request, but not a new PSG teleconference. Canceling your teleconference. If a teleconference is canceled, a subsequent request to schedule another teleconference will be considered a new request. It will be at FDA's discretion whether the teleconference should be canceled depending on specific circumstances. Examples of these may include prospective ANDA applicant or applicant withdraws the request. The prospective ANDA applicant submits their ANDA, or FDA refuses to receive the ANDA. To note, if an applicant cancels a teleconference, FDA will count performance goals as met. If FDA cancels, this will not count towards performance goals. We have now reached our first challenge question. Within what time frame should an applicant submit a PSG teleconference request after publication of the new or revised PSG? 20 calendar days, 30 calendar days, 60 calendar days, or 90 calendar days? I'll give you a few moments to figure it out. And the answer is 60 calendar days. As a reminder, the publication is the date recommended listed in the PSG webpage. Our second challenge question is, which of the following statements is not true? In general, FDA will issue preliminary written comments before a PSG teleconference. B, requests are granted as a teleconference or written response only format. C, a pre-submission teleconference is submitted through the CDER Direct NextGen Collaborative Portal. Or D, submit concerns about the minutes in writing to FDA within 10 calendar days of receipt of the official minutes. And the answer is A. In general, FDA will issue preliminary written comments before a PSG teleconference. FDA will not issue preliminary written comments for a PSG teleconference. In summary, pre- and post-submission PSG teleconferences are new in GDUFA III. The teleconference request is granted or denied within 14 calendar days from receipt of your request. There are two formats, a teleconference, which is audio only, or a written response only. An applicant may choose which format they prefer. Your teleconference is held within 30 calendar days from receipt of your request. The teleconference is typically 60 minutes in duration, and the PSG teleconference can be held for both complex and non-complex drug products. An applicant should request a PSG teleconference when they have commenced or completed in vivo BE studies that are different from FDA's newly published PSGs, which are new or revised. This is a flow diagram of PSG teleconferences and PSG meetings for your review. PSG meetings will be discussed in the next presentation. And finally, this is a research slide that has resources referenced in my presentation. Thank you so much for attending my presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Hee-Sun Chung. I'm a lead pharmacologist in Division of Bioequivalence 1, Office of Bioequivalence, in Office of Generic Drugs. Today I'll talk about the GDUFA III product-specific guidance meetings. The learning objectives of my presentation are to describe the scope of and eligibility for the PSG meeting, describe the communication process for meeting grant-denied decision, explain the timeline and process for PSG meeting, describe the communication process for the preliminary written communication. I will not discuss where to submit the pre-submission and post-submission PSG meeting request, meeting minutes, and dispute of minutes, since they were already mentioned in the previous presentations. I use several acronyms throughout the presentation, and I have included them here for your reference. In GDUFA III commitment letter, the agency agreed to certain timeframes and procedures for scheduling and conducting the PSG teleconference and PSG meeting. The PSG teleconference means to provide feedback on the potential impact of new or revised PSG on the applicant's development program. The purpose of the PSG meeting is to provide a forum in which the applicant can discuss the scientific rationale for an approach other than the approach recommended in the PSG to ensure that the approach complies with the relevant statutes and regulations. The PSG meeting should be used to discuss the questions related to the proposed alternative view approach that is different from the current PSG. The agency will not discuss the questions unrelated to the alternative view approach to the recommendations in the current PSG. Here is an overview of the PSG teleconference and PSG meeting process. And starting from the left side of your screen, once you had PSG teleconference and you need to do additional work, in other words, there is impact from the new revised PSG on your application, then there may be additional questions in this regard. You have three options in approaching the agency. One is to consider the PSG meeting request. Another is to use the controlled correspondence approach, where if the question would involve only, let's say, one discipline, and the question is more straightforward, then control may be more appropriate. After the controlled correspondence, if there are any unresolved issue or if you have any additional questions, then you still have the option to reach out to the agency through the PSG meeting process. It is also possible that in addition to PSG related questions, you have questions arising from different aspects of the application. For example, some scientific question or clarifying question based on the DRL or the CRL that you receive. And so as applicable, you do have the option to contact the agency through different meeting types. For example, in the pre-submission stage, you may consider the product development meeting. If in the post-submission stage, then you might consider enhanced mid-cycle review meeting or the post-CRL scientific meeting. Here are the timeline and format of the PSG meeting if it is granted. The meeting type may be the pre-submission PSG meeting if ANDA hasn't been submitted. There is also post-submission PSG meeting if the ANDA has been submitted. The grant-deny decision will be provided within 14 days of the receipt. The meeting will be held within 120 days of receipt for the pre-submission PSG meeting. For post-submission stage, this is within 90 days. The duration of the meeting will be 60 minutes. The available meeting formats are in-person face-to-face, video conference, teleconference, or written response. The minutes will be provided within 30 days after the PSG meeting. And the number of days mentioned on this slide refer to the calendar days. Now let's talk about the eligibility for the PSG meeting. Unlike some of the other meetings, the PSG meeting is available to both complex and non-complex products. As with the PSG teleconference, you are eligible for one PSG meeting request for each new or revised PSG. You should already have had PSG teleconference, and it should have occurred in the same phase as the PSG meeting that is being requested. And I'll talk about this, what same phase means in the subsequent slide. Specific to the post-submission PSG meeting, you should not have responded to the DRL or CRL if you are considering the PSG meeting. Let's look at what it means to be in the same phase. If the PSG TCON was in pre-submission stage and you're requesting PSG meeting in the pre-submission stage, then this is considered same phase. Likewise, if your PSG TCON occurred in post-submission stage and your meeting request your PSG meeting request is also submitted in the post-submission stage, then this is also considered same phase. However, if your PSG TCON was in the pre-submission stage, but you waited until post-submission to request the follow-up PSG meeting, then this is not considered same phase, and the agency will deny the post-submission PSG meeting request in that case. Let's take a look at the reasons for denying the pre-submission PSG meeting. The agency intends to deny the pre-submission PSG meeting if there was no pre-submission PSG teleconference or ENDA was submitted after having pre-submission PSG teleconference. The agency may deny the pre-submission PSG meeting if the meeting request is incomplete or inquiry will be better suited for the controlled correspondence, or if same or similar questions were submitted in a request for another meeting type or a control. In other words, you don't want to duplicate the request in a different meeting format or other avenues of communication. What about reasons for denying the post-submission PSG meetings? The agency intends to deny the post-submission PSG meeting if there was no post-submission PSG teleconference, or the PSG teleconference was held in the pre-submission stage and the ENDA was submitted and the applicant requests post-submission PSG meeting. In other words, PSG teleconference and PSG meeting requests are not in the same phase. The agency may deny the post-submission PSG meeting if meeting request is incomplete, the inquiry will be better suited for controlled correspondence, or same or similar question was submitted in another meeting type or controlled correspondence. And additionally, if the questions in the meeting package have been addressed during the ENDA assessment, or the applicant responded to the deficiencies in DRL or CRL. Considering the scope of the PSG meeting, it's also possible that the meeting request be partially granted. That is, if the applicant includes questions not related to the alternative B approach, then that question would be denied, while the other question that may be related to the alternative B approach, then that question would be granted. If the meeting request is denied, then the subsequent request to schedule a pre- or post-submission PSG meeting will be considered a new request. The meeting grant deny notification will be provided in a written format. If the meeting request is denied, then the written notification will include the reason for the denial. If the meeting is granted and the agency will be providing only the written response instead of holding a meeting, then we'll advise the applicant that a written response only is forthcoming. What are the things to consider in terms of when to submit the pre-submission PSG meeting request? The meeting request should be submitted in a timely manner after the PSG teleconference, and you should also consider the time needed to develop the meeting package and when you plan to submit the ENDA. For the post-submission PSG meeting request, you should consider the ENDA status and the assessment cycle, as well as the time needed to develop this meeting package. And also, you should allow us to complete our scientific evaluation of this and the submission, and that is refrain from requesting a post-submission PSG meeting until you heard back from us through a DRL or CRL. Another concept to keep in mind is one meeting at a time. So for example, if you are waiting to hear back on grant-denied decision for another meeting, or you are granted a meeting and yet to have had that meeting, then you should not request a PSG meeting. We also ask that you not submit the control correspondence and a PSG meeting request around the same or time with the same or similar question. If you request multiple requests containing similar or same question, then we'll determine which meeting or the request be most appropriate and accept that meeting and deny the rest. There are other options for feedback. I have mentioned the controlled correspondence as well as other meeting types in earlier slide. And for example, there is different turnaround time for various meetings and at different stages of end application. Also, depending on which meeting type you request, there may be impact on the goal date extension, for example. So there are various factors, and you want to figure out what works best for you based on the priorities for your application. The guidance mentioned at the bottom of the screen has detailed information about what to include in the meeting package. So I would highly encourage you to look at the guidance. That said, I did want to put some emphasis on some of the key information for you to consider. You want to identify the meeting type. Is it pre or post-submission PSG meeting? You want to propose the meeting format that you want and include the PSG teleconference date and the event ID, and especially since the prerequisite to PSG meeting is the PSG teleconference in the same phase. Also be sure to include a scientific alternative approach to establishing bioequivalence with justification, rationale, and the data to support the discussion. Also be sure to submit the meeting package and meeting requests concurrently. The PSG meeting may be rescheduled for various reasons, and which include additional information is needed from the applicant. There are essential attendees who can no longer attend the scheduled meeting due to emergency, or there may be additional FDA offices that may need to participate in this meeting, but they cannot attend the originally scheduled date. It's also possible that there's a pending regulatory policy issue that might affect the response to questions, or the federal government is closed or opening is delayed due to inclement weather, emergency, or other reasons. If the PSG meeting needs to be rescheduled, you should not submit a new meeting request. The agency intends to provide the preliminary written comments 5 days before the meeting, and these written comments should not generate submission of new questions. If you consider that the written comments provide adequate response to some of the questions, then you may leave those out in the updated agenda and consider focusing on the meeting time on the remaining questions or any clarification you need from for those responses. And the updated meeting agenda should be submitted no later than 48 hours before the meeting. If you are satisfied with all the preliminary written comments, then you may request to cancel the meeting. I also note that the preliminary written comments are not construed as the final unless there's an agreement between the agency and the applicant. It's also possible that PSG meeting gets canceled. Some of the reason for this could be that the ANDA or the prospective ANDA applicant withdraws the meeting request for one reason or other. Also, if the applicant considers that the agency provided adequate response to their questions in the preliminary written comments. For the pre-submission PSG meeting, if the prospective ANDA applicant submits an ANDA, then the PSG pre-submission PSG meeting will be canceled. For the post-submission meeting, if agency refused to receive the ANDA, or applicant responds to the CRL or DRL, then the PSG meeting, post-submission PSG meeting will be canceled. If the PSG meeting is canceled, the subsequent PSG meeting request will be considered a new request. Let's talk about the expectation on the day of the PSG meeting. The presentation is not required, but if you choose to give a presentation, be reminded that the meeting time will not be extended to include the meeting or the presentation. So be judicious about how you want to use the 60 minutes you have. The discussion should focus on the clarification of the preliminary written comments, and we will not address or discuss new data or questions not presented in original meeting package. Let's take a look at a couple of challenging questions. The first question is, which of the following statements is not true? A. PSG teleconference should have been granted and held before PSG meeting can be requested. B. With each new or revised PSG, the ANDA applicant can request one PSG meeting. C. Both complex and non-complex products are eligible for a PSG meeting. D. The pre-submission PSG meeting will be held within 90 days of the meeting request. Take a few seconds to consider your response. If you chose D, then you're correct. The pre-submission PSG meeting will be held within 120 days of meeting request. The 90 days is for the post-submission PSG meeting. Let's take a look at the second challenge question. Which of the following statements is not true? A. After pre-submission PSG teleconference, pre-submission PSG meeting may be requested if ANDA has not been submitted. B. Post-submission PSG meeting should occur before responding to a possible bioequivalence deficiency identified in a discipline review letter or bioequivalence deficiency identified in complete response letter. C. Meeting agenda cannot be updated after meeting request submission. D. FDA will not address or discuss new data or questions not presented in original meeting package. Take a few seconds to consider your response. If you chose C, then you're correct. Meeting agenda can be updated after original meeting request submission. That is, after you receive the preliminary written response for the questions you consider adequately addressed, then you can leave those out for the actual meeting agenda, but focus the meeting discussion on those questions where you feel the clarification is needed. So that's a scenario where the meeting agenda might be updated. Here's a summary of the PSG meeting. The scope of the meeting is to discuss the questions related to the proposed alternative B approach that is different from the recommendations in the current PSG. In order to have the PSG meeting, you should have had the PSG teleconference in the same phase as the PSG meeting that's being requested. Both the complex and non-complex products are eligible for the PSG meeting. The grant deny decision will be made within 14 days of receipt. The meeting will be held within 120 days of receipt if in the pre-submission phase. If in the post-submission phase, then it will be held within 90 days. The meeting formats available for PSG meeting are in-person face-to-face, video conference, teleconference, or the written response. The duration of the meeting will be 60 minutes, and in lieu of the PSG meeting, you do have the option to submit controlled correspondence or request other meeting times based on the scope of the question and eligibility. Here are some resources that you might consider. The third bullet point is for the product-specific guidance meetings between FDA and the applicants under GDUFA III. And this is a new guidance under GDUFA III and was published February of this year. And I'd like to also bring your attention to the last bullet point for the controlled correspondence related to generic drug development guidance. This guidance was updated and posted December last year. I would like to thank the event organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I would also like to recognize the GDUFA III PSG working group who worked very hard to develop this process for the PSG meetings, and also in developing this guidance. The working group involved members from the various disciplines within the Office of Generic Drugs, as well as our colleagues from the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any question you might have during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you all for the great presentations. We'll now move into our Q&A panel discussion. In addition to our speakers, we welcome Dr. Robert Lineberger, Director, Office of Research and Standards in OGD, Dr. Partha Roy, Director, Office of Bioequivalence in OGD, Dr. Pinaki Desai, Senior Biologist, Office of Life Cycle Drug Products, Office of Pharmaceutical Quality in CDER, Dr. John Ibrahim, Associate Director for Regulatory Affairs, Office of Regulatory Operations in OGD, and Dave Coppersmith, Regulatory Counsel, Division of Policy Development, Office of Generic Drug Policy in OGD. Looks like we do have some questions coming in right now. The first questions will go to Dr. Lei Zhang, and here is the first question. Can an alternative approach to in vivo BE study, specified in the PSG document, without any data, be requested under a product development meeting for non-complex generic drugs?
Okay, thank you for the question. In this situation, if it is for a non-complex product, it will be under the May grant situation. So FDA may grant meetings to applicants in a situation that may be beyond what's described in the GDUFA III commitment letter. And in doing so, normally we'll consider the complexity of the issues and what's the available resources and the workload and what's the anticipated value to the end assessment process. So based on this question, it seems it mentioned alternative PSG recommend method without data. It could be hypothetical. Then depends on what the alternative method they will propose. It may or may not work the meeting. So if the meeting is not granted, typically FDA will recommend sending a control or some other appropriate pathway to ask the question. So it will be depend on the situation. So FDA may grant a product development meeting for a non-complex product if they pose an alternative approach to the PSG. It will depend on the situation. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to the next question for Dr. Zhang, it's the following. If a company has not previously requested a product development meeting for a complex drug device combination product for which there is not a PSG and submits a controlled correspondence to ask a specific question, would FDA advise a company to request a product development meeting?
Yeah, again, it will depend on the question. It seems like this is a complex product and there's no PSG. They will meet the criteria for FDA will grant situation. So most likely FDA will grant the meeting, depends on what question they asked. And I don't understand the question. Did they have a controls or no control? Because typically we don't want the same question to be asked through control and the meeting request at the same time. So if they have a control before, but with a different question, which is okay, they can still send a product development meeting for some other questions related to their product. So again, it depends on the situation. They can submit the request and the FDA will, during the grant deny stage, will assess the questions and decide whether grant the meeting or not. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Dr. Zhang in this round, and here is the question. What are parts in the meeting process that cause issues, and where is there confusion on appropriate steps to take?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I will try to answer this question based on my understanding of the question. I know it's kind of general, but I just want to highlight that under GDUFA III, and the applicants now have a variety of methods to interact with FDA, including the controls throughout the life cycle, like both pre-submission and post-CRL, and also scientific meetings, including product development meeting, pre-submission meeting, now also post-CRL scientific meeting and PSG meetings. So each of these communication pathway designed to serve a specific purpose and have great potential to be valuable to the applicants in developing, help them develop the product and also develop the quality submission to facilitate the ANDA assessment when the application is in-house. So understanding the difference between those different meetings versus controls is very important. It will be determined based on the complexity of the product, whether there is a PSG developed, published or not, or whether what the specific question the applicants may have and what the stage of the development, whether it's pre-submission versus during the ANDA review phase or post-action after they receive the CRL, can all help determine which pathway. So I would suggest the applicant to review FDA's guidance, maps, and also, as mentioned in my presentation, FDA had developed an infographic, which is a useful tool to help navigate through those various communication pathways to determine which meeting to select or whether you want to do controls in lieu of the meetings. Typically, meetings are more address multiple questions, multidisciplinary kind of question. It would be more efficient to go through the meeting pathway. Controls are mainly more like a single discipline focus, more focused question could be deal with controls, and also depend on whether the product is a complex product. Complex product can all help make the decision. So the infographic has the first page is a flow chart to help the applicant navigate through which meetings or which depend on the end stage as well as the complexity of the product. And the second page have tables designed to delineate different meetings versus when to request controls in lieu of the meetings. So I would suggest that's a very useful to help address questions people may have in a confusion, or whether they have a confusion on which route to take. What the FDA observed, we do see people, like for the pre-submission meeting, we do see people may not follow the redesigned feature of the pre-submission meeting by asking questions, which they really should present their unique data to the FDA. So these part applicants should pay attention to. And also when FDA denies a meeting, if the meeting is not appropriate for their meeting request, in general, FDA would recommend a way forward to the applicant, either get a better meeting package or maybe go to control as another pathway. And the other thing is we do, as I mentioned, we do discourage applicant not to send the same question or similar question to multiple meetings or control at the same time, as this could cause some confusion or maybe even delay some of the assessment. FDA will deny duplicative requests and will only address questions within the proper venue. I hope this help address your question, and I hope you found this webinar helpful to address any confusion you may have in the new GDUFA III meeting process. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question, a group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got a couple questions that came in for Karen Bengtson. And here is the first question. Is it possible to request a pre-submission meeting for an ANDA resubmission following a complete response letter?
Thank you for the question. So the short answer is no. Pre-submission meetings are available for prospective applicants before they submit their application. Only addition I would want to add is that if an application is refused to receive, then in that case, an applicant may, if they're eligible, request a pre-submission meeting, but otherwise only available to those in the pre-ANDA phase. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question for Karen Bengtson is the following. If a pre-submission meeting is granted, but we did not have a product development meeting, will we still qualify for a MCRM or an EM-RCM?
Thank you for the question. So if you haven't had a prior product development meeting for that same complex product and only a pre-submission meeting, it's really based on the agency's discretion on whether a company can be eligible for a mid-cycle review meeting or an enhanced mid-cycle review meeting. So if FDA does determine that you can request one, that information will be included in the ANDA filing acknowledgement letter. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got one more question in this round for Karen Bengtson, and here's the question. Can I change an in-person PSUB meeting to video conference or teleconference closer to the meeting date?
Again, thank you for the question. So it is okay to change a meeting format from an in-person to a video conference if needed, closer to the meeting date. However, a teleconference is not the appropriate format for a pre-submission meeting due to the redesign of the pre-submission meeting, which is really intended for a presentation and sharing of screens. So if needed, it would go to a video conference and not a teleconference. Thanks.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got a few questions that came in for Dr. Tao Bai. And here is the first question for Dr. Bai. Is a pre-filled syringe a complex drug-device combination product?
Thank you for the question. So in short, pre-filled syringe is a drug device combination product, but it may not be necessarily eligible for a complex drug device combination product. It really depends on the specifics and the complexities related to the product API or formulation. So here I like to emphasize that it seems people are confused about drug device combination products and the complex products. Some people feel or believe drug device combination products will be eligible for complex products. But in fact, not all drug device combination products are complex. When a drug device combination product has a device design in it, and that device design may not impact the drug delivery to the site of action or absorption, it is typically considered a non-complex drug device combination product. So for example, some simple pre-filled syringe and needle for injectable solution, where the device portion of the product does not play a key role in the dose delivery. In these cases, that these products are not considered a complex drug device combination products. But on the contrary, some pre-filled syringe having a higher level of complexity, including a dual chamber syringe or multi-dose pen injector, those products are eligible for complex generic drug products. So here I'd like to share two pieces of good reference documents with you in case you have additional questions related to complex drug device combination products or in general complex products. The first one is Manual of Policies and Procedures 5240.10, titled with Classifying Approved New Drug Products and Drug Device Combination Products as Complex Products for Generic Drug Development Purposes. And second reference is our GDUFA III commitment letter, in which the complex generic product is also defined there. So please refer to these two documents for additional details if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have a couple more questions for Dr. Bine. Here's the next question. Is there a time by which the post-CRL scientific meeting must be requested once a CRL is received?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Is there a time by which the post-CRL scientific meeting must be requested once a CRL is received?
Thank you for the question. So in short, there is no time limit for requesting a post-CRL scientific meeting request. As long as your ANDA is in the CRL status and your meeting request meets the eligibility requirements, you are eligible to submit the scientific meeting request. So this is different from the post-CRL clarification meeting request. There is a specific timeline, 10 days, associated with the clarification TCON meeting, but there is no specific timeline associated with the scientific post-CRL scientific meeting request.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have one more question for Dr. Bine this round. And here is the question. Can I request both a post-CRL clarification teleconference and a post-CRL scientific meeting at the same time?
Thank you for that question. So a quick answer is yes, you may request these two meetings separately at the same time because these two meetings have different objectives and scopes. So if you feel you have questions falling into the scope of each meeting request, you may submit these 2 separate meeting requests to the agency.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist. A few questions came in from Calliope Sarago, and here is the first question. What kind of response can we expect at the PSG teleconference?
At a PSG teleconference, FDA will provide a pathway forward for the applicant. I shared some outcomes in my presentation, but some additional outcomes may include if FDA has recommendations where, for example, the PSG recommends a fasting and fed study, and the applicant did a fasting study only. In this case, FDA will provide feedback on steps for the applicant to move forward with their application. Also, as mentioned in my presentation, if questions are better suited for submitting through the controlled correspondence pathway, FDA will direct the applicant to submit a controlled correspondence in lieu of holding the PSG teleconference. FDA may also recommend a firm submit a PSG meeting if that pathway will better address their questions or if more in-depth scientific discussions are needed. FDA may also provide feedback, perhaps if a submission is in the early stages of review, such as a pre-CRL or pre-mid-cycle review. In this case, FDA may provide industry feedback that their application is still under review and a CRL will be issuing soon. Another outcome may be if FDA states the new or revised PSG doesn't impact the applicant's development program, and therefore future communication with FDA on this issue is not recommended. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Got a couple more questions for Dr. Calliope Sarago, and here's the next question. If an applicant had a PSG teleconference meeting and the PSG was revised after the meeting, can an applicant request another teleconference meeting?
That's a great question. If the PSG is revised after your first teleconference meeting was held, you may request another PSG teleconference. However, you must meet the criteria for holding a teleconference for the new revision. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Got a couple more questions from Ms. Sarago, and here's the next question. What are some reasons for denying a post-submission PSG teleconference?
A few reasons would be if the post-submission PSG teleconference where the applicant was denied because the A&D applicant withdraws their application, or FDA refuses to receive their ANDA application. Those would be a couple examples. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. I have one final question in this round from Ms. Sarago, and here's the question. When should I submit my teleconference package for a pre or post-submission PSG teleconference request?
Your teleconference package should be submitted to FDA so that it's received concurrently with your teleconference request. Keep in mind that your pre-submission teleconference package will be submitted through the NextGen portal, and your post-submission teleconference package will be submitted through the gateway. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got a couple of questions that came in for Dr. Hee-Sun Chung. And here is the first question for Dr. Chung. For a PSG teleconference, slide 8 states that a PSG teleconference can be requested when the PSG was revised to include an in vivo study where the PSG did not include an in vivo study previously. However, slide 9 states that a PSG teleconference cannot be requested in this scenario. Can you please describe the differences between these two scenarios?
Thank you for that question. This question originally came from Calliope, but I'll answer them since it's more tied to the review aspect of it. So distinction to be made here is the option to demonstrate bioequivalence. So for example, it's possible that the original PSG only recommended in vitro option to demonstrate bioequivalence, and then PSG is revised. So then there is additional option in vivo approach to demonstrate bioequivalence, which means in that case, the applicant can choose either of the in vitro or in vivo option to demonstrate bioequivalence. Therefore, if the applicant initiate the in vitro study, then you're fine and you don't have to go forward and asking about do we need to conduct in vivo study or not, because the PSG is clear in saying that you have these two options to demonstrate bioequivalence. On the other hand, if the PSG only recommended, let's say, in vitro study originally, and then PSG is revised so that now, in addition to in vitro study, you also need to conduct in vivo study to demonstrate bioequivalence. In other words, you need to conduct both in vitro and in vivo study for overall bioequivalence demonstration. Then both studies are needed for the end application. So in that case, since you are following the previous PSG recommendation, and now agency revised the PSG to add in vivo study, then you're eligible for the PSG teleconference and PSG meeting as appropriate. So that hopefully helps to clarify what the distinction between the information in slide 8 and 9 for teleconference. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to the next question for Dr. Chung. And here's the question. Are PSG teleconferences and PSG meetings available only for the original cycle?
Thank you for that question. You remember that PSG can be revised not just during, let's say, pre-submission or the original cycle of the ANDA, but PSG may be revised after CR, for example, or subsequent CR. And so the PSG teleconference and PSG meeting is not limited to the original cycle, but any subsequent PSG revision, then you may be eligible for this process. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions for Dr. Chung. And here's the next question. For post-submission PSG meetings, why should we wait after the PSG meeting to respond to the DRL or CRL?
This is a very valid question. Our rationale for suggesting the PSG meeting only after you listen or get our DRL or the CRL is that, as you know, the PSG upcoming PSG posting is available to the public, and also internally we'll be aware of the upcoming PSG revision, for example. In which case, when we draft our DRL response or the CRL response, we would have considered the impact from the PSG revision on what may be needed for your application moving forward. In addition, let's say if you have to make some modification to the study design or not, or whatnot, it's also possible there are elements that you want to consider if you have to repeat certain study or consider a new study design. And so it would be beneficial for you to take a look at the DRL or the CRL as appropriate based on the timeline to consider what questions you want to ask agency to make your PSG meeting process beneficial and more meaningful for your generic program moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Dr. Chung, and here's the question. If we have questions related to a revised PSG as well as questions on the CRL received, which meeting should we pursue?
Thank you for the question. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that PSG teleconference and PSG meetings, the scope is very narrow. So it has to be tied to the PSG revision or new PSG. But if you have some additional questions besides those related to the PSG, then if you submit that meeting request, we're likely not answer those questions. So if you have additional questions, it may be more useful for you to approach, for example, post-CRL scientific meeting if it's in the post-submission stage. So then you have you get more proper response for each questions you have rather than only select questions. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got a few questions that came in from Dr. Robert Leinberger. And here's the first question for Dr. Leinberger. The regulations outlined under GDUFA III and in the meeting's guidance state that the FDA may grant a post-CRL scientific if, in FDA's judgment, the request raises issues that are best addressed via this meeting process and cannot be adequately addressed through controlled correspondence. Does this language mean that the FDA will allow exceptions to the defined criteria for qualifying a post-CRL scientific meeting request? In other words, will the FDA grant post-CRL scientific meetings in situations where the drug product is not a complex product and it does not include one of the 4 equivalency sameness criteria, but may have a complex regulatory history or other complex and unique challenges?
All right, so just to remind people that the commitment letter outlines the places where you can be assured that you will get your meeting granted. All of the other conditions, again, that are outside the commitment letter depends on available resources and FDA's sole discretion. And so with that, I think you should look at the sort of prioritization. Again, a lot of the GDUFA III meetings, especially the post-CRL scientific meetings, were designed and intended for complex products. And as well, if a question cannot be answered through a control correspondence. So we encourage you to use the control correspondence. If it's a non-complex product, your first venue is to use the control correspondence pathway. This now post-CRL is now available to all products, so you can get a guaranteed timeline for your control correspondence question. But if there is a question where really the control correspondence meeting is not sufficient, i.e. there's something extremely unusual about the situation, FDA has some discretion to accept a meeting request. However, I would encourage you also to use the other things that are available, especially the post-CRL teleconference, to get clarification. Because in those cases, you can also get advice. FDA may direct you to a meeting rather than a control correspondence, and that's one way you might be able to find out if it's useful. But again, for those situations, a non-complex product that doesn't meet the commitment letter, your first option is control correspondence. If the control correspondence perhaps doesn't work, right, then FDA may direct you toward a meeting if there's something that needs face-to-face interaction on that. But again, the recommended and preferred pathway in that situation is to use the new control correspondence mechanism to get input on even more complicated questions.
Thank you, Dr. Leinberger, for responding to that question. We do have a couple more questions, and here's the next question. Can I submit a meeting request for a post-CRL scientific meeting if my questions do not belong to one of the 4 categories specified in the commitment letter?
So if you have a question on a complex product, right, you can always submit a control correspondence. And a control correspondence should be your first option, right? The timeline for answering a control correspondence is faster than answering a meeting. So again, the first option, if you're not eligible for the meeting, is, can my question be answered by a control correspondence? And use that, and that's accessible for all of the products. So we'd encourage you to use that. Again, the post-CRL scientific meetings, if you look at the 4 examples that are given in the commitment letter, are really all about places where it's a new, it's really a new study design, a change in direction from the previous, what was submitted in the application. And so if you fall into something that's like those 4 questions, but perhaps not exactly the situation where you're trying, where it's a new approach to equivalence, then it's possible that FDA would be more likely to grant a meeting in those cases. But again, the first option should be, if I have a question that's about my application, use the control correspondence process to get clarification before resubmission. But again, if it is something that's that's similar in scope to those 4 questions, i.e., a new study design where interaction and discussion about the approach forward would be valuable, then you might consider submitting the meeting request. And then FDA, again, as I said, will evaluate it again based on resources available and the other time commitments that we have. As part of the GDUFA III negotiations, we set up these rules to balance the rules against the resources that were provided for these particular parts of the program. So that's why there's a guarantee of the meeting for certain types of questions, but again, other cases it's up to the discretion. But I think if you're thinking about when you're more likely to be successful in submitting a meeting request, and it's when a question is very similar to the ones that it's on a complex product, and it's similar to those type of questions where again a new approach is needed, and you want to get feedback before resubmission, because FDA's criteria is going to be, is this going to make the review process more efficient? And is this something that we couldn't answer as well in the control correspondence? So if we think, well, look, this is a good question, but we could have just answered it in the control correspondence, that's probably the better option. And many of your control correspondences, you'll get an answer faster than even waiting for the meeting response. So the control correspondence, again, should be the first option. Again, in very specific situations where the control correspondence type approach would not be appropriate because of the type of question that's asked, those are cases where you might want to submit a meeting. Or if you've had some previous interaction with FDA where we might recommend your follow-up be a meeting request. For example, if you send in a control correspondence, our response to that control correspondence might be that you might consider sending in a meeting request, or you might hear that from some other interaction. So there may be cases where FDA staff might direct you toward that meeting process because we believe that it would actually meet the criteria of making it more efficient and be better than and be more appropriate than the control correspondence. But again, control correspondence is the first option. Meeting for the non-complex products that fall outside of what's in the commitment letter. Because again, that's going to be part of our decision. If you ask us something we could easily answer in a control correspondence, we're just going to turn that meeting request into a control correspondence, or redirect you to the control correspondence pathway.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions for Dr. Leinberger, and here's the next question. If we are in the middle of an in vivo study that is different from the PSG recommendation, do we have to wait until we have the outcome of the study to request a PSG teleconference?
So that's a good question, and it gets to a little bit broader question about why does our guidance recommend that you use the PSG teleconference quickly and immediately after the new PSG is posted. And so that's our incentive is, if you think about this, and in general, it's in your interest to have that PSG teleconference as soon as possible. Because if you're waiting for if you're waiting for the outcome of studies, at the PSG teleconference, it's not a scientific review. So FDA staff don't have enough time to review the data that's in your study and the results of your study. So it's not really useful to try to wait for the PSG teleconference to get some results. It's better to have the PSG teleconference right away, discuss the study design. Because one of the things that can happen at the PSG teleconference is FDA staff will tell you, because we know when we've changed the guidance, and we've already thought about, well, if someone followed our previous guidance, what advice would we give them? You'll get that advice, and it may be that the study that you have underway would be appropriate, and our advice to you would be, when that study is complete, submit your application. And you get that answer right away. If you wait until the study is complete, you'd still get the same answer, but you just get it, how many months later, and that doesn't seem like it's useful. So again, also, if the a situation is more problematic or challenging, right, at the PSG teleconference, FDA staff say, well, maybe the answer will depend on the results of your study, and then we might give you some direction on what type of analysis of that study you might want to submit with it at the PSG meeting that follows up the teleconference. So again, as we think through the situations, in cases where the study's in progress, it seems like it's almost always beneficial to you, the applicant, to have that PSG teleconference right away. And then if there is something that depends on the results of the study, we would really redirect you to the PSG meeting, and then we'd also give you some direction on what we'd be looking for in the study, and you can analyze it and provide the data summaries that help make your case and discuss that point. But then you can get started on that meeting submission process sooner by having the PSG teleconference sooner. So I would say that in almost all cases, it's in the benefit of the applicant to, as soon as you become aware of this PSG change is affecting a study that I've completed or is in progress, have the PSG teleconference to understand what the situation is and what your next step is, and then you can do the most effective next step. You might get some feedback that would say, well, if your study's in process, we would consider looking at this aspect of the data along with something else. You may get some feedback that's valuable and helpful for your follow-on. Or you may get, sometimes the change in the PSG is governed by changes to the reference product and our fundamental regulations. And, we can be very clear that, an additional study or some other study is going to be needed. And we'll explain to you a little bit more why and the rationale. And that also can help you think about what your next step is, whether, once you understand a little bit more why we made the change and how it relates to your situation, you can make a more informed decision about what to do next. So again, I would say that in almost all cases, it's in the interest of the applicant to, as soon as you're aware of the PSG change having an impact on your development program, to have that interaction with FDA right away. And then you can move on to the next steps, because we have all the follow-on meetings or follow-up approach, and we'll give you the direction, and you get to that follow-up faster by having that initial teleconference and figuring out where you are.
Thank you, Dr. Lineberg. We have one more question, and here is the question. The 60-day is not in the commitment letter. Why is FDA proposing 60 days?
I think, this gets back to a little bit of my previous answer, but I'd also ask the people in the audience, why would you wait for more than 60 days? Because getting this information is valuable to you, and the sooner you find out and get that answer to the question, the more, the more informed your decision for your next step can be. So it's sort of baffling to me why you would wait. So again, we recommend 60 days, but we encourage people, if there's sort of a use case or a situation where you think that more time would be appropriate and more helpful, please send that in as a comment to the guidance so that we can consider that. But again, 60 days is the recommended time to get this in, because we think that in all of the scenarios where we think of it, there's no scenario where it's in your interest as the industry not to know what FDA is thinking about that revision. So we encourage you to have that interaction with us in a timely manner. But again, given also that, and part of it is also the resources as well, right? If we, we don't want a situation where, oh, I have this idea, I can have a PSD teleconference sometime in the next year. But again, if there are reasonable reasons why a different time frame would be appropriate, we encourage applicants to suggest that in the comments to the docket as well. Again, based on the resources as well. We haven't received a large number of these PSG teleconferences. So again, we certainly will answer the question if you ask it at any time, but we're just sort of it's hard for us as FDA to understand the situation where you'd want to wait to have this interaction. It's in your interests to, and it's getting a brief teleconference. There's not a large meeting package to prepare. But again, if there's some other time that also meets that goal and is sort of reasonable as well, encourage you to submit that comment to the guidance docket as we're considering any revisions or finalizations of that guidance. If there's some other perspective or scenario which you think is valuable for us to consider. But as we were thinking through from the work group, what's the situation where it's better for the applicant to wait and not know what situation they're in? Like this is intended to help you make better decisions going forward. So, that's our perspective on why it's written that way. But we if there are alternative perspectives, please share them in the comments to the docket.
Thank you, Dr. Lionberger, for responding to those questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got a couple questions that came in for Dr. Partha Roy. And here is the first question for Dr. Roy. Can I just request one post-CRL scientific meeting and ask both scientific and clarifying questions without asking for an additional post-CRL clarification TCON?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Just to think about this a little bit more in terms of why we have created the post-CRL scientific meeting. I think obviously with those 4 criteria which will make you eligible for such meeting, this is an opportunity to have a little bit more discussion in the scientific approach, the new approach that you are taking. So you have a little bit more room in this new meeting where you can actually get into the discussion, understand FDA's thinking, and how it can be helpful to you to move forward with a new approach, right? I mean, that's really the essence of creating such a meeting, so that you can have a little bit more discussion. Now, in this process, if you have some clarifications, questions that are sort of connected with the CRL, then obviously you can ask those questions, and I'm sure within the context of the scientific discussion, we will be able to clarify, and then probably we'll be able to bundle and address your clarification questions at the same meeting. But in an ideal way, I mean, you need to submit each meeting request separately. I mean, that's sort of the line, but you also need to realize that there are different timelines for each of these, and one would be a 90-day versus a 30-day. So if you wait for your clarification questions to be answered, that means you need to wait longer to get the answers for your clarification questions if you want to get the answers bundled within the post-CRL scientific meeting. But also, we realize that sometimes the clarification questions might be somehow a little bit related to the new approach that you might be taking. So, taken together, you may want to have those questions clarified within the bigger post-CRL scientific meeting discussions. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got one more question that came in for Dr. Roy, and here's the question. Once FDA gets to review the meeting package, will the assessment team be sending information requests to seek additional information from the applicant as needed? If yes, what is the time frame when the applicant can expect such communication?
Yeah, that's a great question. After your meeting request is granted during meeting package assessment phase, I mean, if the FDA assessment team identifies any questions for your meeting package, we may send an information request to you, but we obviously want to do it as soon as possible. And typically, such information request will be sent, within the first 45 days. Uh, in order for assessment team to have an adequate time to review your additional question, generally you'll be given 1 week time to respond to the agency. So, our intent is to kind of limit the information request that we will be sending it to you. But there may be sometimes situations where we feel the need for asking you that extra question so that we can comprehensively answer your scientific questions within the meeting. So we may ask you certain questions, um, but we really don't want to make it a regular practice. We probably in a rare situations we will be asking some information requests if needed. But again, I mean, our intent is to ask this question as soon as possible, so that we can work on the responses appropriately and comprehensively. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist, we have a few questions that came in for Dr. Panaki Desai. And here's the first question for Dr. Desai. As per guidance, the agency recommends that the meeting request for a PSUB should be submitted approximately 6 to 8 months before submission of the ANDA. If PSC submission is planned for the ANDA, should I consider a 6 to 8 month timeline for the PSUB meeting request before the submission of the PFC?
Thank you for this question. In general, you may consider the timings of your ANDA submission. However, if the information that is going to be submitted in your PSUB meeting package, which will be affecting the pre-approval inspection, then you may consider the PSUB timings before the submission of your PFC. Such examples may include when you are proposing to use unique analytical method, or when you are proposing to use unique manufacturing technique, etc. Thank you. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions for Dr. Desai. Here's the next question. Is it okay to submit questions for the agency in the PSUB meeting package?
Thank you for this question. So the short answer to this question is that we would not recommend applicant to include questions to the agency in the PSUB meeting type of packages. The PSUB meeting is the opportunity for you to meet with the agency and to present your unique and novel data or information to us. So if you are planning to include that you are planning to include in your ANDA submission. Additionally, we would encourage applicants to submit meeting packages in a presentation format. The presentation outline template is provided in the appendix to the formal meeting guidance. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. I have one final question for Dr. Desai. And here's the question. What is the benefit of submitting my meeting package as a draft presentation if high-level information is generally acceptable?
So if you do not meet the criteria in the GDUFA III for when FDA will grant a pre-submission meeting. In other words, you do not, if you did not have a prior PDEL meeting with the agency, or you had a PDEL meeting but your product is non-complex, the draft presentation may assist FDA in determining if the pre-submitting would likely be approved or improve the A&D assessment efficiency. That's why we encourage applicants to include the high-level information in their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got some questions that came in for Dr. John Ibrahim. And here's the first question. Will submitting updated stability data after the review has commenced be considered an unsolicited amendment, and will the goal date get extended?
Thank you very much. If additional information is submitted to the ANDA that's not generally a response to a deficiency or an inquiry from the FDA, like updated stability data, yes, then that could be considered an unsolicited amendment, and that could extend the goal date. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions that came from Dr. Abraham. Here's the next question. Is there a specific time frame for the post-CRL scientific meeting to be submitted? For example, the post-CRL scientific meetings need to be submitted within 10 business days after the issuance of a CRL.
Thanks again. This is similar to a question that Dr. Bai answered, but to reiterate, there is no time limit for requesting a post-CRL scientific meeting or receiving a goal date that's associated with that. Any ANDA that's in CR status that's eligible for a post-CRL scientific meeting that meets those eligibility requirements can submit one of those post-CRL scientific meetings. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions for Dr. Abraham, and here's the next question. Should I include the criteria noted in the commitment letter that my ANDA falls under in the meeting request?
Thanks so much. Yeah, for a post-CRL scientific meeting, it's important to include the specific criteria associated with your ANDA to help us manage your meeting request more efficiently. If for reference to these specific eligibility criteria, it's under C1A of the GDUFA commitment, GDUFA III commitment letter. Thanks.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one final question for Dr. Abraham, and here's the question. Do I need to specify which type of meeting I'm requesting in the meeting request package?
Hi, thanks. So yeah, for the specific meeting request that you submit, it should be included in the heading of your cover letter what type of meeting request you're submitting for. For example, for scientific meetings, you would want to submit post-CRL scientific meeting request to differentiate that from a post-CRL clarification meeting to make that a little bit more easier for us to manage when we receive it. And that's best placed in the heading of your cover letter. Thanks.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got some questions that came in for Dave Coppersmith. And here's the first question. How do you clarify the meeting minutes from the PSG teleconference if the remarks are unclear?
Thank you for the question. So an applicant that's requesting clarification of the meeting minutes issued by FDA after a PSG teleconference should contact the assigned FDA point of contact for that teleconference. And the applicant should contact that FDA point of contact within 10 calendar days of receipt of the official meeting minutes to seek that clarification. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions that came in for Dave Coppersmith, and here's the next question. Can I submit a request for a PSG teleconference more than 60 days after the PSG was published?
Yes, applicants can submit PSG teleconference requests more than 60 days after the PSG was published. As Dr. Leinberger mentioned earlier, we recommend that applicants submit within 60 days after the new or revised PSG was issued so that FDA can provide timely feedback to applicants. The 60-day timeframe was included in the draft guidance for industry, product-specific guidance meetings between FDA and applicants under GDUFA that was issued in February for comment. FDA will review the comments that we've received, incorporate suggested changes when appropriate, and then either issue a revised final version of that guidance that represents FDA's current thinking on this topic, or a revised draft for comment. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Got a couple more questions for Dave Coppersmith. Here's the next question. Could you elaborate on when a controlled correspondence may be more appropriate as opposed to a PSG meeting?
Thank you for the question. So you can refer to the draft guidance for industry controlled correspondence related to generic drug development for more information on controlled correspondence. But as stated in that guidance, the purpose of the controlled correspondence process is to provide a mechanism for a direct inquiry about FDA's position with respect to a particular element of generic drug development, and for the agency's direct, brief, and timely response. A PSG meeting may be more appropriate than controlled correspondence if an applicant has multiple questions or the applicant's questions involve feedback from multiple disciplines within FDA. Applicants may also want to consider their planned timeline for ANDA submission or responding to a bioequivalence deficiency, and the timeline for a response from FDA, because there are different timelines for responses for level 1 and level 2 controlled correspondence, and for holding pre-submission and post-submission PSG meetings. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Dave Coppersmith, and here's the question. Does an applicant have to have had a PSG teleconference before the applicant can request a PSG meeting?
Yes, in order to be eligible to request a PSG meeting, either a pre-submission PSG meeting or a post-submission PSG meeting, an applicant must first have a PSG teleconference with FDA. One thing to note, and as my colleagues have mentioned, that under GDUFA III, there are different meeting types that are available to applicants. So if an applicant has not had a PSG teleconference and would like to discuss an alternative bioequivalence approach with FDA, an applicant can consider requesting another meeting type or submitting controlled correspondence as appropriate. So for example, if an applicant receives the mid-cycle discipline review letters and has not yet had a PSG teleconference and is eligible to request an enhanced mid-cycle review meeting, the applicant could consider requesting an enhanced mid-cycle review meeting to ask questions related to a proposed scientific approach to address those deficiencies that were identified in the mid-cycle DRLs. So that would be an option available to that applicant in that situation. But as I said, there are different meetings available, and applicants should just consider which one would be best for them. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving up to the beginning of our panelists, we have a few more questions that came in for Dr. Lei Zhang. And here's the first question. For a combination product which PSG suggests the conduct of clinical endpoint study over 2 years, since PK data can be generated for the specific API, what would be the best path to have FDA's inputs on the use of a PK approach?
Yep. Thank you for the question. So I would assume this is a complex product, and if we consider the PK approach is the alternative approach to what's being proposed or recommended in the PSG, then that applicant will be eligible to request a product development meeting. So the request depends on the stage. If it's in the pre-submission stage, they can request a product development meeting instead of a control correspondence. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions, a couple more questions for Dr. Zhang, and here's the next question. Can I change the meeting format to video conference later if the meeting was granted as the teleconference?
Okay, yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation, no, you cannot change the meeting format from a teleconference to a video conference after the meeting is granted. However, if the meeting is granted as an in-person meeting or as a video conference, it may be changed from an in-person to a video conference or from a video conference to a teleconference, if the applicant thinks the preliminary response are satisfactory and maybe the remaining questions are clarification in nature. And also, as I mentioned in my presentation earlier, the applicants should be aware of the difference between teleconferences and video conference and choose the most appropriate meeting format in the meeting request. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Got just a few minutes left, and I'm trying to get in one more question with Dr. Zhang. And here is the question. Will FDA accept a pre-ANDA meeting for non-complex products?
I think this question has been, a similar question has been addressed before. So it is the May grant situation, most likely, because a lot of meetings, pre-ANDA meetings are designed for complex product. So control may be the first option, but FDA do have the discretion to decide whether grant the meeting or not, depends on the issue, and also whether the meeting can enhance the efficiency of the ANDA assessment. Thank you, and also whether resources are available. Thanks.
Well, a huge thank you to our presenters and panelists for your very informative and timely talk, and also for responding to numerous questions that came in. We'd like to welcome back Dr. Leinberger to provide some closing remarks. It's my pleasure to present Dr. Robert Leinberger.
Thank you, Ray. And on behalf of all the staff in OGD and in CDER's generic drug program as a whole, we want to really thank the SBIA staff that helped organize this wonderful webinar. We want to thank all of our presenters who took the time to go through and make these presentations. You know, the implementation of these GDUFA III meetings, you know, behind the scenes, there's a lot of work groups where people work through a lot of the different scenarios. And hopefully this meeting gives you a little bit deeper presentation than just reading the guidance and helps explain, you know, why things work this way, what are some of the considerations, what are some of the edge cases. And we really appreciate the time that the presenters took to put these presentations together, and also recognizing that all of these presentations, each one of these different meeting types had a work group with many, many more FDA staff involved that helped, you know, refine this and provide comments and feedback. So it's really a, you know, a sort of whole program effort that you're seeing channeled through these presenters here today. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you who participated by asking questions. I think this helps us understand what's not clear. It helps us design future trainings. It helps us revise guidances. Really just helps us build a better generic drug program. So we really appreciate people who take the time to ask questions, even difficult questions. I think those are the best kind. And, you know, so hopefully you all found this workshop very helpful. I think, you know, again, as I mentioned before, the goal from this was to try to explain with a little more depth the rules than in our commitment letter and our guidances, how the meeting processes work, what we actually do at the different steps in the process, give you a little insight into the edge cases, help you, understand the rules more, understand also the thinking that FDA went through as we were developing the guidances and the practices around these different meetings. And we hope that this will have two primary outcomes. One is that all of you who are listening will be able to go back to your organizations and, you know, use these meetings more. This is something the generic industry negotiated, access to these meetings. So when you're eligible for these meetings, when you find yourself in the development of a complex product, right, before you submit the application, you know, use that product development meeting if you're doing anything, you know, different than what's in the guidances, or even if there's challenges implementing the guidances. We generally, you know, are open to product development meetings that, you know, deal directly on things that are you found to be difficult to actually do, even if they're in our product specific guidances. And, you know, we strongly encourage you to use the new pre-submission meeting process. If you've had that product development meeting and you're doing something new, to take that additional opportunity to, from you get this sort of, 60-minute, 1-hour meeting block to talk directly to the review team, help them see the big picture of your application, help them see what's new, why it's there, the previous interactions that you've had. FDA staff then can really go back and be prepared to review your application. If there's things that are novel in the application, if you share them with FDA at that pre-submission meeting, our staff are more likely to be well prepared to review those when they come in the application in a few months later. So again, use these meeting processes that you negotiated. As your application progresses through the submission, if you find yourself in a CRL, if you use the things that were negotiated in GDUFA III, use the ability to ask control correspondences after the CRL to clarify before you resubmit. If you're in one of the situations where you really have to do some new study that wasn't in your previous application, and it's something different than our guidances or some unusual situation, those novel studies, that's what a meeting is best for. So those are the cases. We try to enumerate those cases in the commitment letter, but there may be other things that fit in that same spirit of, look, I have to do a new study. There's not a guidance that tells me how to do this new study. I want to have some interaction with FDA so I do the right study to help my application get approved. That's what we mean when we say help the application be successful, make the review more efficient. If you do the wrong study, that's wasting everyone's time. So in cases where what study to do is ambiguous, those are the cases where you might think that the post-CRL scientific meeting is important and valuable for your development programs. But again, you can always, another, I think, underlooked feature of GDUFA III is now you can ask for any question. It's a complex product, it's a non-complex product. You can use that control correspondence pathway to ask the question, get feedback in 60 days in most cases before you resubmit the application. And hopefully that will be a significant contribution to getting things right the first time. And finally, we hope you got from this meeting and webinar, an idea of how to be more effective in using the meeting processes, how to make them fit together, how to see all the pieces that you can do. All right, clarification questions, fast answer here, then follow up with a scientific meeting if appropriate. Think about also in the pre-development space. All right, work through the pre-development meetings, maybe a stepwise approach for a very complex product, to make sure one part is right, then come back, use the control correspondence to get input on the device constitutive part of your application, and then use the pre-submission meeting to get FDA oriented to the novel approach that you're taking in your application. So just think about using these, but also using them effectively. And what types of questions, hopefully you've gotten some feedback on what types of questions will be really appropriate for the different meeting venues. And so, with that, it's been great to participate in this webinar. And we hope that you all got a lot out of it. And so I'll turn it back to Ray to help to do the closeout logistics. So again, thanks to our SBIA colleagues for making this webinar work smoothly and well. And back to you, Ray.